things off. So thank you for joining us today for developing pathways for an outcome-based approach to building energy performance. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning, and want to thank IALD for allowing us to present on this particular topic that we've been working on at the California Energy Alliance for a little while now. Just as a heads up, this is being recorded for future reference, as well as please participate on through the Q&A function. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, we will have some time at the end for you to ask questions, but please go ahead and shoot those in the Q&A, and we'll try to answer them real time if we can. If not, we'll hold them off for the end. And if you do have any technical issues, please use the chat function, and one of the IALD staff members or ourselves will be able to help you through that. For a little overview of what we'll be discussing today on this webinar, I'm going to go through some introductions, overview as to sort of the context of this particular topic. And then we'll go into looking at market drivers for building performance standards and outcome-based code. And then we'll dive in a little bit deeper into the California Energy Alliance's outcome-based code initiative, some of the activities that are being worked on, and then really want to spend some time getting a lighting designer's perspective. And we'll also have some Q&A time there. So the idea today is to really get some feedback from this particular stakeholder group. So thank you all again for joining us. I want to introduce our panelists and some of the speakers for today. First, we have Dima Zamaras from the Center for Sustainable Energy. She is a manager for the Distributed Energy Resources team at CSE, where she supports DER demonstration and evaluation projects. Dima is a licensed civil engineer, and prior to joining CSE, she worked as a consultant in building enclosure design and construction. We also have John Zielinski from Presino Energy. John is an innovative thinker and value creator, passionate about delivering better customer engagement through more effective marketing. As the managing partner at Presino Energy, John strives to provide small and medium-sized business owners unparalleled marketing strategy and execution services suitable for their business within the energy efficiency, sustainability, and building construction ecosystem. John previously served on the board of directors for the National Association of Energy Services Companies. In addition, he has previously held leadership positions in engineering, business development, and marketing with industry leaders such as Honeywell, Commonwealth Edison, Lutron, CertainTeed, and Philips. And we have Michael with HLB Lighting, Michael Lindsay. He is committed to delivering designs that weave together programmatic requirements, budget, and aesthetic considerations. As he designs with light, he carefully considers both its artistic and scientific properties in order to reveal the architecture as envisioned by the client, as well as create spaces insensitive to the human experience. After 8 years contributing to the HLB Los Angeles office, Michael spearheaded the opening of the HLB Denver office in 2016. He has been expanding his technical and artistic knowledge of lighting design with projects across multiple market sectors, looking to weave in aspects of lighting design to ensure warmth and comfort to building occupants. Michael brings his passion for lighting design and commitment to the environmentally responsible design solutions. He also serves as a member of the IALD Energy and Sustainability Committee, providing input on code development primarily across the United States. So we're excited to have those three speakers here to provide some context for us, and then to give us that lighting designer's perspective. And my name is Josh Dean. I'm the executive director of the California Energy Alliance. Prior to taking this post at CEA, I was the executive director with the San Diego Green Building Council. So come with some background and experience in sustainability, construction, and real estate industries, and working with government agencies, businesses, and nonprofits to deliver projects and education around sustainable strategies. So again, thank you all to the speakers, for everyone joining us today. We definitely have some intriguing topics that we want to get to and share some perspective that we have. But first, I want to highlight a little bit about the California Energy Alliance for those that might not be aware of who we are. But we do, our vision is to see a healthy and equitable built environment that is powered by carbon-free, reliable energy sources. Our mission is to work to bring beneficial, equitable changes to energy standards, policy, and programs by developing consensus among diverse and engaged stakeholders. A lot of what we do is around the evolution of code, standards, and policy. And so writing and helping advise on different codes and policies and standards, such as California Title 24, the Energy Code. And to help support that, there's a lot of research that happens, and then education and outreach. So some of what we're doing today is that education and outreach to also help support the research that we're looking to do with our outcome-based code. Also just want to highlight the diverse group of stakeholders from the energy and building backgrounds and industries that we have at CEA that really help bring this diverse group of knowledge and expertise to the table as we discuss various initiatives that we have at the CEA. And before I go any further, did want to just highlight a little bit of the results from the poll. We asked, what's your knowledge level of an outcome-based code? And how will outcome-based codes or building performance standards impact your client/working relationships over the next 5 years? With the understanding that some of you may be coming to this webinar to just learn. Some may already have some knowledge. So it's great to see the results that some have no knowledge, some are somewhat familiar, not really sure how it's going to impact you going into the future, but then about 50% do see it as a significant thing coming forward. So thank you for that feedback. It'll kind of help set up a little bit of our discussion today, as well as the Q&A going forward. And finally, before I turn it over to our first presenter, did want to just hit on and provide a little bit of quick context about CEA's outcome-based code initiative. And Dima will go into this a little bit more detail later, but just to provide a little bit of context as how these speakers are coming together and why we're really presenting this the topic and doing this presentation is to get some of that feedback from industry stakeholders, such as the lighting design community, because we do see that there is an impact and how we can potentially learn from your work and how this can play a role in this overall approach. So we do want to gain some of that feedback, but the idea is that we can look at an outcome-based code as something that uses actual measured energy for actual measured energy use as the overarching metric for demonstrating code compliance. So kind of looking at that new construction design, what does that look like as we go into showing actual code compliance versus building performance standards, which is the topic that was asked in the poll question. Those are typically mandatory policies that require building owners to meet performance targets by actively improving the energy performance of their building over time. So a little bit of a delineation there between new construction and existing buildings, but there is an overlap, and we do see that. And Dima will kind of touch a little bit too on where we're maybe heading in this direction of an overlap between the new construction standards and design into ongoing performance of buildings. And so really want to lay this out with first, our first speaker, John, kind of laying what's coming, what are the market drivers behind building performance standards, just building performance in general, why are we looking for that? And then how does that maybe overlap with what happens on the new construction side? And that's also where we really see a huge impact and things that we can learn from the lighting design community that's been already doing some of this work in the past and potentially with lighting controls as well. So we do understand that, there's going to be different views from local and state efforts and even national. There's some liability concerns and hurdles when it comes to an outcome-based code. There's still needed research as well as policy. And so we're going to be diving into a lot of these topics as we continue on with our speakers. And with that, I want to turn it over to John Zielinski to take us through a little bit of these market drivers that we were discussing earlier.
All right, thanks. This is my contact information. As you can see, I'm a professional engineer. I like to call myself a marketer who is fluent in engineering. So what I try to do is try to take these technical types of concepts and translate it into a communication style for my customers. That's what I'm going to try to do today is we're kind of talking a little bit about these building performance standards. So just go to the next slide, please. So let's first start talk about market drivers for building performance standards. If most of us are very familiar with the energy codes around the US, around the globe and kind of what's going on. But even with all the energy standards that have been in place for quite a while, we're still having these issues with climate change. So with lots of arguing over what's right, what's wrong, there is a group of cities around the globe, the C40 cities, I'm sorry, that have come together and say, we are going to do what we can to reduce climate change. And energy efficiency is a huge part of that initiative for climate change. And because if you think about it, the only way for carbon emissions to really get to the goals that are being targeted, even with the Paris Accord and with a lot of these local mandates, is to reduce the energy consumption in buildings. And the only way to achieve that significant scale is to be able to put in some kind of a building performance standard that starts to reduce how our energies operate. Because if you actually look at the way an energy code is set up today, an energy code is really just a prescriptive measure. So it's just a sign off that says, hey, we used a certain piece of equipment that was approved and we check these boxes, but it has nothing to do with how the building performs, how the building changes, and all those things over time. So by putting in these building performance standards, these C40 cities are doing a couple things. One, they're actually sharing best practices with one another. So as these mayors and the city councils start to look at what's working, what's not working, they're starting to take this kind of information and communication and kind of bring that across, to their ongoing codes and standards and what's going to happen. And if you think about it, even with the Paris Accord and what a lot of these local standards are pushing, is they're really talking about carbon neutrality, right? So by 2050, we are supposed to have reduced our carbon emissions pretty significantly. And from an owner's perspective, building performance standards allow them to start to choose the types of technologies and how they are going to operate their buildings in the future. And when they actually look at it, in fact, as you will see here, there's a couple links. I would encourage you to actually go on their website, even take a look at their annual report, because you will see some of the things that they're highlighting, and these are probably pretty unfamiliar to you today. Over here on the right, we have one, we're talking about New York City, which we're going to talk about quite a bit. And when you look at the market drivers for a lot of these cities, there's really three major categories for this. And the first one, of course, is carbon reduction. The second one is they're actually looking at job creation in those particular cities. So what types of new jobs can they start to create that are going to have an impact on their local economies moving forward? And then third are the economic and social benefits. So these are such things as public health, improved indoor air quality for the occupants in the buildings, which is the citizens that where they live and where they work. And really, if you're really optimizing how your buildings perform, the theory goes that the more money will fall to the bottom line and have it available for other types of programs. Next slide, please. So we start talking a little bit more about the market drivers. If you look at the percentage of carbon emissions from our building stock here in the US, on average, 40% of all greenhouse gases that we generate here in the United States comes from our buildings. But that's the average. If you look and drill down a little bit more, you can see in most of these major cities that the carbon emissions is much higher. New York City, 70% is attributed to their commercial and residential buildings. Washington, D.C., 75%, Boston, 60%, Philadelphia, 62%, even San Francisco, which is, in California, which has some of the most stringent energy code for quite a while, is at 56%. So the buildings that we work in, the buildings and types of systems that we design are all basically energy efficient. In fact, according to the US EPA, they're saying that 30% of the energy in our buildings is just pure waste. So moving forward, it's how do you start to reduce that to meet the end goal of reducing carbon emissions? Next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit here about the building emission standards here. So in New York City, they have a requirement now on the books where buildings greater than 25,000 square feet have to benchmark and report their energy consumption data. Now, this is not how much lighting are they using in the building, how much cooling they're using in the building. They have to report on an annual basis how much energy per square foot. So it's getting into an energy usage intensity to kind of understand what's happening. And there's a link here as well that actually provides some more details on the compliance. But in the image that we have on the screen, all of these buildings are actually listed and published. So anyone can go in and see what buildings are forced to comply what the address is, and moreover, for these buildings as well, they have to publish a report card that is located at the entrance or in the lobby of the buildings. So it's just like you're in school, you have an A, B, C, D, F grade that you show. So your customers, your employees, everybody else that's that's walking by has a chance to see how that particular building is performing. And if you think about it, there's consequences to that, because in the world that we live today, this is kind of like public information, and with social media and everything else that's out there, non-compliance can actually come with a lot of operating risk, not only to your bottom line on your energy budget, but how do your customers feel about it? How does your board, your employees, what's really important? And having this public information can really damage somebody's reputation. Next slide, please. So now we're going to drill down a little bit more, and we're going to start pushing to this what is called Local Law 97. So this is an actual map in New York City. It's a live interactive map. So you can see in the color in yellow just how many buildings and kind of what that footprint looks like on that type of global perspective there. And beginning in 2024, these buildings are going to be forced to comply with the New York City Local Law 97, which limits the amount of energy that each of these buildings are able to generate. Now, these buildings, when they were first designed and they were constructed and they received their occupancy permit, they most likely met energy code. But what I really want to stress here is that just because a building met energy code 5 years ago, 10 years ago, today, even next year, it does not necessarily mean that it is going to comply in the future with future building performance standards. So this is an ongoing, it's a stretch goal. If you go to the next slide, Josh, that there are real consequences to this. So over on the right, you can actually see 3 of the different categories that Local Law 97 carries. And there's different energy use intensities allowed for certain types of buildings. And what you will see there is that in between 2024 and 2029, there is a certain metric tons of CO2 per square foot allowed for each of those buildings. And then beginning in 2030, that number reduces. So between now and 2050, which is the goal to get to an 80% reduction on the path to carbon neutrality, each one of these building owners is going to be required to reduce their overall energy consumption in their buildings. And it's not just the energy consumption, but it's where they get their energy from. If it's from renewables, but anything that's emitting carbon emissions is going to be penalized. And over on the left here, if you actually look at it, there are penalties for non-reporting. So as a building owner, 50 cents per square foot per month as a penalty for non-reporting. That means that you have to have a metering in place. You have to have the documentation. You have to be organized and report this to the city. And beginning in 2024, if you are over the threshold in that particular building, you will have a fine of $268 per metric ton that you contribute to carbon emissions. I know that in the construction world, there's a lot of workarounds and people try to avoid these types of things. But with the city, they've actually had it where providing false statements does a couple things. One, it provides for huge fines and penalties, including up to $500,000 in time in jail. But you also have to have a licensed professional sign off on the documentation, whether that's a licensed architect or a licensed engineer. So you have to have a licensed professional that's putting their license on the line every time that they submit this to the Department of Buildings. This is the kind of a building performance standard that is really looking on how an individual owner is operating that building. And it's very important, again, that that an owner knows what's going on and what those types of consequences are going to be. Next slide, please, Josh. So many of you are fully aware that lighting has become a very reduced impact on energy consumption in a building. So, most of the new lighting now are LEDs, lumens per watt. Exceeding 200 lumens per watt on that. So, with higher efficiency lighting, the overall percentage contributed to lighting in a building system has significantly reduced. It used to be 40% of a building would be attributed to lighting energy, and that number is getting much smaller, and that's why it's kind of shown here. But the most significant, as you're probably aware of, is probably the HVAC system. It's really kind of cooling driven in that matter. But a lot of these buildings in a place like New York and up north also have a lot of gas and oil heating and things like that, which are all measured and reported on. Another area that is increasing significantly is plug load. So when it comes to lighting, a lot of task lighting and things like that are now being put in these particular buildings, along with other things such as space heaters and everything else. But why is that important that you are aware of this? It's because it has a real financial impact to the owner, not just in their operating cost, but with these building performance standards in place. Each one of these buildings is going to be on a fixed energy budget. So when you look at your square footage of the building and what your total carbon emissions are, how do you get to that number? Whether you're using renewables, whether you're using on-site generation from wind, solar, whatever that may be, battery storage, you have to take into account what your particular design, what your particular system, what's contributing to the overall energy consumption of that building. So the fact that lighting is such a low number, you can say, well, it's pretty insignificant. But as we go to the next slide here, I'm going to just give you some basic math here. So this is how a calculation is done when you're trying to figure out what your overall electric bill cost is. And I'm not getting into details of distribution costs, but on a pure energy basis here. And what I use as an example here is a simple 12-watt downlight. So a simple 12-watt downlight operating for 14 hours a day, 365 days a year at 10 cents per kilowatt hour uses 61.32 kilowatt hours per year. So at 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and you can adjust that for whatever region of the country that you're in, if it's more or less. But at 10 cents, it costs that owner about $6.13 in that energy consumption, which you might say is not very much. But if you go to the next slide, now let's put that into context of carbon emissions. So 61.32 kilowatt hours of electricity in any given year equates to 0.043 metric tons. So how many of these light fixtures do you have in the space? So if the building owner is over their carbon emissions threshold, that individual light fixture can cost almost twice as much as the annual energy consumption of that particular fixture, right? So $6 to use in energy, and almost another $12 in financial penalties. So by exceeding that particular limit, that's where having these buildings where you drive by and lights are on, 24 hours a day, even when the building is not occupied. When you have spaces that are lit, either inappropriately because they're either overlit, or you have too many, or there's no occupancy sensors, or someone has taped over a sensor or bypassed the controls. That's where these types of penalties now start to increase. So So up to twice as much a year is going to be hitting the owner's pocketbook just because of the contribution that lighting has. Now, it might be the cooling system, it might be the plug load, it might be everything else that's throwing that particular building over that threshold. But to get to the true cost of what an owner is spending to operate that lighting system has a whole new complication to those calculations. Next slide, please. So now let's start thinking here a little bit about the building itself. And I thought this was a pretty good analogy because when I started off my career, I was a consulting engineer. And it's kind of interesting because a lot of times the work that you do when you do the designs just normally doesn't get noticed, because if you have good air quality, and for that matter, good light quality in a particular space, your occupants are happy. When your occupants are happy, no one complains. When do they complain? Is when there's something wrong with the lights, when there's something wrong with the air quality, when an office space is stuffy, when things are not starting to kind of feel right. So having that kind of power over the types of designs that you have really impact a healthy building. And especially with COVID, I think with air quality becoming kind of front and center here of what's supposed to happen in our buildings, everyone's kind of aware now that air quality has probably not been up to snuff in a lot of these particular buildings. There's a lot of dining outside. We still haven't occupied a lot of the buildings. You're talking about MERV filters. You're talking about all these different other types of things. So the same types of conversations that I feel you could even have for lighting quality as well. Talk about lighting quality, you're talking about circadian rhythms and everything else. So improving that overall environment of the building is very critical for the health of the occupants, the operations of the building, and things like that. So how do we do that, right? So how do we educate the owners and the occupants and the entire ecosystem of the type of value that we are contributing to their environment? Next slide, please. So we mentioned quality here. So I put this slide here for a purpose because Energy Star is almost the gold standard when it comes to efficiency. So we've been conditioned, and they have a reputation that when you see an energy rated or an Energy Star rated product, that automatically means that this is a great product and this is something that we should be using. But with my experience in the lighting world, we know that that lighting and Energy Star don't always go hand in hand. Just because you have an Energy Star rated light fixture, the light quality from that light, whether it's CRI or even the application of light in that particular space, is not necessarily addressed. And education is just something that is just lacking in our industry. And when it comes to the types of building performance standards and the types of things that are on the table right now, that's where I think the lighting design community can have a voice. Next slide, please. So having that voice and bringing your expertise to the conversation, I think, is a very, very critical approach. Because when you're talking about building performance standards, we're not talking about silos anymore. We're talking about how do all the systems in the buildings work together. And even from my own personal experience, just kind of knowing a little bit about how these buildings are designed, there's not a lot of communication between the different disciplines. I know, even when it comes to heating and cooling systems, a lot of times there's safety factors, there's equipment that's not designed properly. Nobody wants to have a system that can't meet the load or the requirements of a given space. So what do? They oversize the equipment. So it's the same thing in lighting. Sometimes you put too much lighting in there. If they don't have a lighting designer on board, which is probably 99% of the time, what do when they come out and replace the lighting? Are they looking at the watts? Are they looking at the lumens? Are they looking at the application? Kind of what's going on. And that's where I think that if as a lighting designer, I think you could step up and provide some guidance and insight as to actually what these building performance standards should include when it comes to a lighting perspective. When you're talking to your clients and you're trying to educate them as to how a building performance standard might impact them in the future, there's in my mind there's a clear message about the value of having the right light in the building is going to have for that particular owner. We're going to get to that in just a second, but let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So let's talk about having a voice here. And I took this directly from the IALD's website. And there's a couple things I want to point out. One of them is the actual communication part, right? So good lighting contributes to the overall building environment, but with the least impact on the natural environment. In a building performance standard, it's not just the natural environment, it's the environment of the entire building. So when you're looking at whether it's outdoor lighting, you're looking at indoor lighting, it's how does lighting impact what needs to happen in that given space. And when it comes to helping to establish what types of considerations should these jurisdictions and code bodies should be thinking about, I think having the input of the lighting design community would be very important and add a lot of value to where lighting should be viewed in the future. Next slide, please. So I took this slide from Costa Papamichael. He's presented many times at IALD, and this is a combination of a couple of his slides that he used a couple of years ago when we was talking about code. And in lighting, you want to have the right light at the right place and at the right time. And I think that's even it's even more important even today moving forward than it was in the past, because having the right light, the right place at the right time, make sure that you are energy efficient, that you are creating a healthy environment, and that the building occupant is doing exactly what they need to do in that given space. The only wild card in this is having the right light at the right time. Might have a shift in how that building owner changes how they occupy that building, depending on the energy consumption requirements, whether you're using solar, battery powered, things like that. Because when it comes to lighting systems, and I'll give you an example. So if you have battery storage with renewable energy from light and solar, everything else, that battery storage is managing kind of how that the energy is being dispersed through that particular system. So the lighting system is drawing a certain amount of power off of that particular device over a period of time. So being able to then manage and shift how power is consumed during those periods of the day is very important. And that's where lighting controls is really going to be important moving forward. It's it's not just a nice to have. I think it's going to be very essential to have lighting controls and those advanced data analytics to how that building performs over time. And the other thing I want to point out here too is when you actually look at the lighting metrics. So look, at the very bottom there is how effective is illuminance as a metric when it comes to lighting. So how many times do you go into a space and the light is it meets the current standards, but it's not really designed properly. And again, most of the time they don't have a lighting designer on board. You have either an electrical engineer or you have a contractor that's doing design build, that's just throwing out lighting, and you're just dumping a bunch of light into a space. So this is where I believe that the lighting design community can help start to guide and shape as to make sure that the right light is in the right place and at the right time. Next slide, please. So here we're talking a little bit more about what's in the headlines today. In the news, almost on a daily basis, you're actually reading something about climate change, whether it's wildfires in California, hurricanes, flooding, everything that's going on. Climate change is front and center. And if you look at the individual cities, if you look at the individual states, a lot of changes are starting to happen. We talked a little bit about New York City and Local Law 97. Illinois and Chicago are starting to look at carbon emissions there as well. St. Louis has adopted a performance standard. The state of Colorado has up in Washington. Things are starting to happen. And we started off this presentation talking about the C40 cities. Again, the mayors and these committee members are actually exchanging information. They're talking about what works, and they're trying to drive those types of policy changes that are really going to reduce carbon emissions in those individual spaces. Next slide, please. So here is a map of the US that shows which states and cities currently have greenhouse gas emission reduction goals in place. And if you look at the Northeast, you look at the West Coast, and you look at just about every major city throughout the United States here, there's some type of greenhouse gas reduction goals already in place. So over on the left, I have a small list of cities here that show how much carbon emissions are attributed to each city on a global perspective. 20 US cities meet the global top 100 for carbon emission or carbon emitting cities in the world. So again, if you don't have a building performance standard around you today, I would have it definitely in the back of your mind that says it's going to come. And if you have clients that that have multiple locations across this geographic footprint, it's time to have a conversation with them just to let them know on what kind of value and what types of things that you could deliver to them as a lighting designer when it comes to the impact that lighting has on the building, and what having no controls or the wrong light or things like that can have on their overall budget and their reputation. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Dima.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate that, and providing some insight into the market drivers and kind of laying a little bit more of the context of building performance standards, what's coming, and how that is impacting different industries, and specifically the lighting design community. So now I want to turn it over to Dima from CSE to drive in a little bit deeper into what's happening with CEA's initiative around outcome-based code, and then more specifically, what's happening here in California. So Dima.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, so I'm going to narrow the focus a little bit and talk about the outcome-based code and the California Energy Alliance's current efforts. So next slide. So John gave us a really good overview of things going on all across the states, but as I mentioned, we're going to focus now on just California. Next slide. So, there's a lot of really good things happening in California. Of all the states, it has one of the most stringent lighting code requirements. And, just a few years ago, we had AB802 Pass, which is a statewide benchmarking ordinance requiring benchmarking for buildings 50,000 square feet or greater. And then, across the smaller jurisdictions, the city level, we're seeing more and more building performance standards. So it's essentially taking, benchmarking it one step further, as John explained, and actually requiring further action to hold building owners accountable for their building's energy performance. Next slide. So Josh generally introduced the CEA earlier, but just wanted to give like a quick overview again of some of the working groups that are happening right now in the California Energy Alliance. So as Josh mentioned, it is a member-based organization. There are folks from all across the energy industry, so nonprofits, academia, private industry, all across the board, and we're all collaborating on some of the hot topics in industry right now. And I also wanted to just point out that a lot of these topics are very interrelated. I know John touched on that a little bit in his presentation, but no one of these can really stand alone. But next slide. We're going to focus on outcome-based codes in this particular presentation. And to be honest, the more we've been working towards working on this initiative, outcome-based codes is starting to become a little bit less relevant of a name for this. It's kind of more of an outcome-based approach, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Next slide. Great. So as I mentioned, the outcome-based code is a working group from CEA, and there's pretty much kind of three main things we're trying to accomplish in this working group. So the first being the fact that there is a perceived what we call gap between the energy performance of a building that we predict per our code requirements and then what is actually happening in our building. So we really want to be able to demonstrate that that gap actually exists and also to be able to quantify it. You know, the idea of having an outcome-based approach in code would make the energy code simpler for designers and allow more flexibility without sacrificing the performance that we want the code to achieve. And then finally, we also just want to better understand the factors that cause our buildings to perform worse than we expect. So what is causing, you know, we have a building designed to code, it meets all the requirements at certificate of occupancy, but then a year, you know, down the road, it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So better understanding that so that we can make recommendations on how to improve performance. Next slide. So, you know, as you probably have realized listening to this presentation, this topic is pretty complex. There's a lot of different sides to it. So I have just kind of the four big ones on the slide here: research, policy, regulatory, and education. And they're all like very, very interrelated. So the research piece is, you know, what I was alluding to with the demonstrating that there is this perceived gap. So it is a very data-driven problem. You know, we can look at the energy usage of a building and have like hard numbers on kind of what our buildings are doing. And the idea is that that data will make a case to inform policy and then regulation. So that's where policy and regulatory, the regulatory side of things come into play. So, you know, to put this in the context of an example, for AB802, you have a policy in place that is also related to, you know, research. It's collecting data and understanding, you know, what are particularly large size buildings, you know, 50,000 square feet, what they're doing. And then, you know, there's also a regulatory aspect to that. And how do you collect this data and how do you sort through it and how do you enforce that buildings are actually complying with this policy? And then, you know, the last piece that I haven't really quite touched on yet is education, but it's also, you know, that's very topical. That's really what we're doing here, right? Like we want to talk with the stakeholders involved. There's a lot of different industries that touch this overarching issue, excuse me, of building energy performance. And so speaking with, you know, the lighting designers or the HVAC folks, like we need to bring everyone to the table to have these discussions and understand the best pathway forward. Next slide. So focusing more specifically on like what our working group itself has been doing. Originally, there was kind of a quasi 10-year plan put into place with getting an outcome-based compliance pathway into the Title 24 Part 6, which is the California Energy Code. So, you know, we're all aware that there right now are two compliance pathways in the code, the prescriptive pathway and then the performance pathway, which performance is a little bit of a misnomer. It's, you know, the modeling based pathway, but the idea would be to ultimately have an outcome-based pathway where the code compliance is measured based on how, or code compliance is determined based on how the building is actually performing. That way, you know, as I mentioned before, it makes it a little bit less restrictive in the design phase. So looking at this plan, originally the group was hoping to get some, you know, initial language into Title 24 in the 2022 code cycle within the exceptional design section. With that leading to having a test, you know, alternate compliance pathway in 2025, and ultimately having a third compliance pathway officially incorporated into the code by 2028. Next slide. So that kind of leads into the two big initiatives within our working group coming out of last year and into the beginning of this year. So we were really focused on getting some code language added into the 2022 code cycle. So that was the first step of the plan that I showed on the previous slide. So we put together a proposal earlier this year, but it didn't end up getting accepted by the CEC. But there was a lot of good kind of knowledge sharing that happened in that activity, because the California Energy Commission came back with quite a few comments for our proposal that I think will help kind of frame our direction as we try to build out what a outcome-based approach would actually look like. So that's everything from how would this process be enforced? How would you hold building owners liable? What metrics would you use to assess performance? So there's a lot of questions that came out of this, but I think that it really helps us have like a well-rounded discussion around this topic. And then the other thing that came out of this effort was that the CEC told us that based on their limitations with Warren-Alquist, which the Warren-Alquist Act is what made the CEC and defines like what their jurisdiction is and what they have control over. But from the CEC's perspective, their influence stops at certificate of occupancy. So they feel that they have the ability to regulate in the design phase, but once the building has been occupied, it's no longer in the design phase. So they would have no jurisdiction or control over how a building is actually occupying. So to have an outcome-based approach, which would look at how a building is performing, after certificate of occupancy in, maybe the first year of building operations, as a means to assess the code compliance, the CEC doesn't feel that they have the ability to step in that period after certificate of occupancy. So that goes back to, the fact that this issue is very multifaceted. So this would be a big policy issue we would need to tackle to change, what is outlined in Warren-Alquist to allow the CEC to have this third compliance pathway if this is how we decide to proceed. And then the other big piece of effort that our working group has worked on is the research side of things. So we had put together a pretty extensive research proposal for 2 different DOE grant opportunities. And the idea of this is to be able to show this perceived gap. So the research was going to be over 3 years, and we were going to look at pretty large portfolio of buildings, so 500 to 1,000 buildings, and assess, what was predicted in the modeling phase and the design phase of these buildings, and then look at 12 months of energy usage data and kind of better understand what exactly this gap is across all these buildings, and then should look even deeper at like what kind of was causing some of these discrepancies in between like what the code expected the buildings to do and what the buildings were actually doing in practice. And unfortunately, neither of those grant opportunities panned out. Next slide. So that kind of brings us to, our next steps in our path forward going into next year and what our plans are going forward. So we're really at a crossroads in this working group. I think it boils down to the primary focus is still starting with that research piece. We really believe that having a data-driven approach would be able to make us a stronger, compelling case for whether it be further studies or to influence policy and regulatory changes. So that is one piece that we're still really holding on to. But the next bullet here, another item that has come up, and I think we've kind of touched on this all throughout this presentation, but there are kind of 2 approaches that we see. There's either the code-based approach that would more closely impact the new design of buildings, and then there's the building performance standards, which are becoming more and more common and prevalent. So right now, that's a really hot topic in our working group. We're trying to decide the best pathway forward, whether we still want to be committed to trying to get a change to Title 24, or if it makes more sense to go the more local building performance standard approach and then maybe a statewide building performance standard. But we think the research will kind of help inform which direction makes most sense. And then ultimately, once we decide a pathway for an outcome-based approach, there's a lot of work to be done on what the actual framework for that looks like. So I mentioned that a little bit with the comments we received from the CEC for the exceptional design language, but there's still a lot to be worked out in terms of, as I mentioned before, metrics and enforcement and liability. So next slide. Kind of brings us to this thing that comes up a lot in our working group meetings, but sometimes it feels like we have a little bit more questions than answers, but that's why we are excited to be here having these conversations, get some feedback on what the thoughts are coming from the lighting industry, and continue to move this effort forward.
Thanks, Dima. Really appreciate that, and the overview and kind of diving deep into what CEA is working on and this topic around outcome-based code or some sort of outcome-based approach when it comes to really understanding true energy performance in buildings. And so to be able to kind of bridge this gap, we wanted to bring in Michael Lindsay from HLB Lighting to give this lighting designer's perspective. Kind of posed a couple questions to him ahead of time, but wanted to just get your feedback first, Michael, on some of the thoughts, perspective, any just sort of opportunities and hurdles that may have come up, and what you're seeing around maybe the enforcement and liability issues when thinking through some sort of outcome-based approach.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. And I'll start by just mentioning this is incredibly fascinating to me, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my thoughts sitting in the role of a professional lighting designer, and hopefully I can properly represent my community. But I know we have some folks online here that will probably also have some thoughts and opinions. So I look forward to hearing some of that later as well. And, as a designer, I continually recall the times that I'm driving down the road or walking around the city, and I see, multiple floors of a high-rise office building that have all of the lights on. It's quite obvious that nobody's there, yet everything is still burning, right? And I find myself wondering and questioning, do we really have the right approach? Or are people simply skirting the system, and it's all this work that we're doing to try to be respectful of our environment and limited resources that we have here, really doing anything? And so I do appreciate kind of earlier seeing that lighting has minimized a little bit more its footprint in the built environment, but that doesn't mean there's not more work to do. So, looking through for opportunities, I think that if it's correctly set up and managed, which I'll preface that that's no easy task, right? It's easy for me to say, but to execute, as we've heard, would be difficult. I do think this approach has the opportunity to show true and real energy savings. Right now we're probably more sustainable in theory as it relates to design and not as true application. And as a lighting designer, our goal is really to execute beautiful design that reflects the overall vision of the team, of the owner, in the most efficient way possible. I think it was great earlier we heard, the statement of the right light at the right place at the right time, right? That always really should be on our mind. But currently the only metric we have to gauge against is energy code and simply filling out a spreadsheet, right? Doing the math. I would really love to see the data of how much energy is really being used by a building. So as I mentioned earlier, I think it was great to hear, John, you had mentioned kind of the strides the lighting community has made in terms of our impact and part of the building from an energy perspective. And it really does warm my heart, if you will, to hear that we're already have done a lot, but it doesn't mean that we can't do more. And so maybe the low-hanging fruit does live in the HVAC or plug-in world. But I always want our lighting design community to strive to do better and improve even more. From a hurdles perspective, I think a lot of them has already been identified, which is great. The first that comes to my mind is change. Change is often met with resistance. I think we can all relate to that, whether it's in our personal or professional life. And so I think the design community would be interested in evolution, but it's always difficult when it's a dramatic departure from what is known. And anything of this magnitude really requires the industry involvement and engagements. I think this is a great step. It sounds like your collective teams have already done a lot of other fantastic things as well to engage the community, but the overall collective team that's part of this process has to be engaged. They have to have a stake and an ownership in the outcome. So that's meeting with developers, contractors, designers, really as many folks as possible in that chain to engage in the development of the idea. We heard earlier what I'll kind of coin as the liability and enforcement side of things. Right now, it's easy to define responsibility early on, and you have a clear path towards compliance, right? You fill out your form, you do the math, you walk away. Our major hurdle is, how do we define this process, right? Who's responsible for the outcome, and what happens if it doesn't meet the design, right? Is it a designer issue? Is it an operator issue? How do we draw those lines of responsibility? Understandably, we're going to find that money is always the driving factor and the concern. And so, putting my corporate hat on, we obviously need to operate as successful businesses, as lighting designers. And so how do we continue to do so with this potential introduction of added risk and perhaps even more work on the design side? Because I think for the fellow lighting designers on the call, we all know that our fees aren't necessarily going up, right? So, I think that the other piece will be, how do we define what the culprit is if a building is not performing the way that it should be? How do we identify that lighting is the problem as opposed to HVAC or plug loads? Again, I know that it's possible, but it's something to consider. And so we've touched on and heard some of the things about how compliance is enforced, but that's important. I mean, Dima, you noted the challenge of jurisdiction right now as it relates to the CEC. Once they get their occupancy, they sort of walk away. So again, getting them involved and sort of in that enforcement is a big challenge. And I think the final piece, because I know I've talked a lot on hurdles, is the education side of things. We're always on behalf of the IALD looking to champion our industry and our role as lighting designers in that process, right? We always want a seat at the table. We believe that we bring real value to the built environment. And at the same time, the reality is that most of the lighting done in the world is not actually done by trained, qualified lighting designers. So we're going to continue to push that, and try to get lighting design professionals executing beautiful, comfortable, and energy efficient designs. But we also can't be naive in thinking that there are plenty of scenarios where sales reps are just throwing lights into a building to help put money in their pocket. There's other designs by electrical engineers, interior designers, contractors who frankly have more important things to worry about than the intricacies of lighting. So that education will be really important as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that perspective. And I know we got a couple questions and we'll get to those here in just a second, but did want to ask, a couple more quick questions to you, Michael, just in terms of, you touched on things like liability and the hurdles and the opportunities. And part of this whole webinar today is to get some of that feedback from the lighting community. And with lighting have been such a major focus in trying to reduce energy because it's that low-hanging fruit up front. And the lighting design community also being the first to kind of help really integrate some of the controls. And how can we, maybe learn from your community in terms of informing other systems? You mentioned the HVAC, sort of whole building items that are using more energy, as John pointed out, than the lighting system. But how can some of the lessons learned be shared with everyone else from what the lighting design community has seen?
Well, it's tough. Controls are an important piece, and they are a hot button issue for a lot of people. And the biggest thing is it needs to be intuitive. Whenever we've introduced complication as it comes to lighting controls, the end user frankly finds some way to just bypass it all. We run into the common example that we always use is people simply taping over the daylight sensors in a space because, well, I don't want my lights to dim, right? Or disconnecting occupancy sensors altogether. So inevitably that turns into lights just being turned on. So whatever happens with controls needs to be intuitive. And because of that, we also have to consider the maintenance staff. A lot of times we run into issues with maintenance are comfortable with what they're familiar with, right? They don't want to learn maybe new things or have to maintain complicated systems. So there's often quick pushback to that. And so, I certainly don't have a solution. Don't get me wrong, but it's looking to make sure that anything that's done is effective first and foremost, but also intuitive. And again, that communication with those individuals, getting them on board, I think is critical to that process.
If I can add something here to what Michael just said, and it kind of relates to Brittany's question, the fact that there's all these bypasses out there in the world today, I think that goes away with building performance standards over time, because if you look at the whole educational process and where the design team gets in, now all of a sudden you actually have a baton that you have to pass on, and everybody's got to keep that baton up and going. And when you're trying to close out a job, I've been on job sites and watched the process. I mean, the contractor's just trying to get a sign off. There's no one from the owner's rep. There's no one there trying to understand what's going on with the system. And then now all of a sudden you have an owner that has multiple systems that work, and the people that are managing it, what do? They make sure that everything is running. They make sure that the lights are on, because if the lights are off, they get a call. And if they get a call, they, now all of a sudden there's a service requirement. They have to report on all this. So it's better, on off seems to be the default. But now they have to get educated on how they're going to operate it, because they're going to be measured every single year on how much energy that they use. And whether or not that, the lighting is 10% or 20% or 30% of a building's energy use, every dollar is going to count if you're over that threshold. So everyone from the design team to the owner to the contractors and everybody involved have to be fully educated, and they have to understand exactly what's happening in that building at all times.
Great. Thank you for those perspectives. And yeah, and I think even Michael, you mentioned it, and then Dima answering this other question from Brittany about the Title 24, any other changes looking at this, addressing the gap, that it really does come down to that certificate of occupancy. And so when we think about liability, think about enforcement, think about compliance, it all kind of stops there. But I think also ultimately, Michael, you kind of mentioned the aspect of maintenance and what happens after we open up a building or begin to operate these buildings. What does that look like? And I think it kind of, maintenance, we tend to shut things off. We tend to kind of disconnect things, and the building's then not operating the way we expected it to. But for me, I think that it's also kind of lending itself to this other idea and topic around healthy buildings and what we've seen from the past year and a half with the pandemic. And what can an outcome-based approach do? It doesn't have to stop with energy. It could, overlap with, metrics that are happening with indoor air quality and ventilation, and maintenance being definitely one of those issues of sort of this ongoing item to help keep buildings in tip-top shape. What do you kind of see from the lighting design or the lighting community side of things when we think about healthy buildings and what it looks like now when designing versus how they're actually being operated and maintained?
Well, I think it's interesting because when I first think about healthy buildings, I don't necessarily I won't draw a direct line or correlation to energy savings, right? If we're saving a lot of energy, that doesn't mean it's going to be a healthy building. So a lot of times I feel like there's in general a disconnect, but I'll be honest, just in listening and going through this, I do recognize that there is some of that connection, right? I think about a healthy building is meant to be that the occupant is happy, is enjoying the space, and thus is also healthy as well. So thinking at it from a lighting design perspective, comfort does come with lighting, right? If it's executed correctly, we are contributing to a comfortable and safe space. So while there may not be immediate overlap, I think, John, you made the great point earlier that it's just high quality design. And if we're executing poor lighting design in a building or HVAC design in a building, and it's just not working well, people are going to get upset. And the reality is that directly ties into healthy building, because there you go, those people are not enjoying the space, and thus we are not contributing to them being happy in the building. So to me, it comes back to continuing to strive for high quality design. And we would talk about high quality design. It again goes back to that right light, right time, right place, right? And doing so that it's facilitating a comfortable overall environment for the occupant.
Great, thank you. And I know we're running a little past, but this great conversation and I think great ideas. And as Dima, presented, the CEA initiative and this idea around an outcome-based approach in general has been shifting. And so anything else you want to add, Dima, maybe kind of hearing some of these other questions or seeing some of the questions from the audience and hearing Michael's perspective in terms of how this can kind of move forward or some of the next steps there?
Yeah, sure, Josh. I would just say, like, it kind of goes back to my comment about more questions than answers. I feel like we've made a lot of good progress and had a lot of really powerful conversations, but there are a lot of sides to this. I think we're still trying to figure out the best pathway for it. I don't think there's necessarily a silver bullet here either. Right now it feels in our conversations that we're leaning a little bit more towards the building performance pathway, just because the barrier with Warren Alquist is a pretty big hurdle. I mean, there'd be some pretty significant policy legislative changes required to actually overcome that and to have the CEC be open to having any sort of influence after certificate of occupancy. So yeah, I guess my 2 cents is that I'm feeling like the main focus still is the research, but I'm thinking in terms of implementation, the building performance pathway is probably the one that we're leaning towards, but I think the research will tell us that. And then in terms of the conversation around healthy buildings and some of these other adjacent topics, I think there really is a lot of overlap, and it also goes into where we still need to decide in whatever outcome-based approach we decide to go with, what metrics we want to use. And there have been conversations around whether we use a purely energy-based metric or a metric that's more of an environmental metric. Maybe it's more directly tied to GHG emissions or those other considerations. So I just think that all these things are very strongly connected. You can't really separate one from the other. And yeah, it's exciting because there's a lot to figure out, but it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think point to that whole idea, and Brittany just said there is a silver bullet, but what we are finding from this is that it is, and as you pointed out, a lot of overlap from various initiatives happening, but it's also how do we set buildings up so that they are performing the way that we expect them to, both from energy perspective, healthy indoor environments, all those kind of things, so that we're actually putting the occupant and the people occupying the space up front and in the center versus kind of just how we expect the building to perform. So definitely a lot that we're learning from a lot of this research and insight. And that's exactly what we hope to do today, was to get some of that feedback from everyone in terms of what you're seeing and some of those other types of opportunities and different hurdles that we may not have thought about as we move forward with this particular initiative. And so I do, again, want to thank you all so much for joining us today. Wanted to leave a slide up for all of our contact information in case there's any additional feedback or insight or various thoughts or ideas that can come forward with this. And if you are interested in helping us pursue this initiative, like we pointed out, this is a very large topic. It overlaps with a lot of other areas in the building industry. Excuse me. And as we excuse me, and as we move forward, we definitely want to get a better understanding of how this can relate with all the different industry stakeholders when it comes to a building, because it definitely, as buildings become more fully integrated, it's definitely going to overlap. And there's a lot of lessons we can learn from everyone, from the lighting design community, from the HVAC community, engineers, contractors, the maintenance and operations folks. So definitely please share any additional feedback that you may have, because we definitely want to see something like this move forward so that the industry can put a strong focus on true energy performance in a building and not necessarily just sort of designing and walking away and hoping that it works out the way that we expected it to. And so with that, I definitely want to thank our speakers today, our panelists, Michael, for representing IALD and setting in and giving that lighting designer's perspective. Dima and John, thank you so much for presenting on sort of the context of what's happening out there across the country, and then narrowing down into California and what that outcome-based approach sort of initiative is looking at. And then finally, want to thank IALD for giving us this opportunity to present on the topic of developing pathways for an outcome-based approach to building energy performance. Again, please share any additional feedback and reach out. And we thank you so much for joining and tuning in. Thank you.